I know My Protein back in the day, I don't know whether they still do it, used to do an elite range that was more expensive. I know Bulk Powders used to do or Bulk they're called now, aren't they? They used to do like I think it was called like the Black Edition range, and that was Informed Sport. But I think companies like them who generally deliver to the mass market of gym users pulled out of sport a little bit and removed the elite range because of, firstly, the cost. They wanted to keep the protein per serving as low as possible and realised the elite range wasn't quite doing it in terms of people weren't switching towards that. So again, looking on websites like My Protein or Bulk that are really good for cheap protein, 9 times out of 10 their products aren't going to be Informed Sport, and from what I've looked at recently. So trying to see what some of the pro athletes are using as well. So the classic one I always say is that have a look at what your local rugby clubs or football clubs have got as their sponsors, because typically, or all the time, they won't go with somebody who isn't Informed Sport. So their like actual reason for partnering with a certain brand is yes commercial, but also they wouldn't just go and partner with a supplement company that isn't Informed Sport, because the athletes won't be able to use them from there.
No, that's really good to know, because I imagine there's a lot of people out there now buying very cheap stuff, and probably a lot of the younger generation now get their information from social media, so helping us get that knowledge out I think is really important. Now I just want to kind of switch to considering someone who's either thinking about or going to adopt a plant-based diet as we've defined it in this episode, and some of the challenges that they might face we've covered. So what advice do you have for someone who's going to try and adopt that plant-based diet?
Yeah, I think don't do it as an impulse decision. Have your reasonings behind it. If the reasoning is performance, then we're doing it for the wrong reasons. If the reason you want to adopt a plant-based diet is for morals or your kind of ethics around kind of the treatment of animals, for example, or potentially that you maybe don't like the taste of meat, or you've gone off meat, for example, then absolutely fine to kind of go down that route. I think if we see another athlete that's plant-based, then all of a sudden we assume that we're going to become that athlete. If we go plant-based, as we discussed earlier with the rugby lads and talking about them just coming in with plant-based foods because one player decided to do it after watching a documentary, then we're doing it for the wrong reason. So first and foremost, make sure that your reason is strong. Now, most athletes that I work with will almost try and convince themselves, I think, that they are wanting to go plant-based because of certain reasons, and then at the weekend I ended up having a steak, or at the weekend I fancied a Domino's and I couldn't be bothered getting the vegan one with the vegan cheese, so I just got normal Domino's. And it's got to be like a lifestyle choice that you make, as opposed to just fluttering between the two. Don't get me wrong, if you want to do meat-free days for an environmental reason, then absolutely fine, but again, make sure we're planned and prepared leading into that. And I think preparing is key. So we've spoke a lot about, I don't want to call them the dangers of plant-based eating, but the concerns or the areas of nutrition that we might need to put more emphasis on. Make sure, firstly, you've watched back this episode, because that will give you some of those areas that will help you. But secondly, go and do a bit of research. So what foods do you like that are high in iron? What foods do you like that are going to replace protein intake? What, maybe trial it for a week first and foremost. See how we get on. Again, we've spoke about the GI discomfort with the higher fibre. Know that that's going to be a thing. And actually, if we're prepared for that, if we're in the middle of a competition season, so like a runner, for example, that's got maybe a marathon coming up or maybe a few 5Ks coming up, depending on the style of runner, the challenge is then going to be, are we going to be optimal for that specific race? It might be something of a decision that if we're happy to take it a bit more lightly, doing it during the off season, and then bringing it into the pre-season and the season. Or as a runner, it might be that we do it when we're on non-competition training as opposed to comp training. If we're tapering down to a specific event as a runner, then it's going to be a challenge to suddenly just click our fingers and change our kind of food intake and assume that everything's going to stay exactly the same. The body's going to react differently for everybody that kind of opts towards a plant-based diet. So being mindful of that first and foremost, but then also setting that plan in place that you've got the kind of contingency of protein. So, as opposed to me and you walking out of here and going, we're going to be plant-based eaters now, and then I'm going to go and buy a bag of spinach for lunch, and I'm going to get rid of my Coronation chicken sub that I've got sat in the car for lunch. Quick on-the-go shout that was, by the way. I didn't prepare my meal prep as I normally would today.
What a nutritionist eats
in a day. Coronation chicken sub is what I've gone for today, with the 2 boiled eggs options for a little bit of an increase in protein. But again, none of that's plant-based. So if I suddenly binned that off, went back over to the Tesco over the road, didn't bother looking at the plant-based specific foods and went, right, what's plant-based here? Right, I'll have a fruit pot and I'll grab maybe a kind of Caesar salad, but not use the Caesar sauce because it's not plant-based. And all of a sudden I'm just eating leaves and fruit. Then I'm going to feel pretty hungry come my tea time and actually probably give up on being a plant-based eater. So although a lot of the recommendations aren't there to put you off being a plant-based eater, I think it's more about the sustainability of it. So if we can find that kind of smooth transition towards being plant-based eating, if that's what we want to do, as I said, morally and ethically, if we want to go down that route, it's just making sure we've got the contingency plan in place so that nothing changes in terms of our macro and micronutrients, so our carbs, fats, proteins, and then those key vitamins and minerals that we've discussed in regards to making sure that we kind of have them available within plant-based foods.
Yeah, so it sounds like preparation and knowledge is key. Something you said there, do your research on what's high in protein, iron that I might enjoy. Where do people do this research?
So often people do the research in the wrong areas. So they'll go on Instagram and they'll start searching like vegan or vegetarian. I think for me, we're very fixed on social media being a platform of good knowledge, whereas a lot of the times it isn't. So I think going online, reading through articles, there's often some really good infographics as well. If we go into like Google Images, that'll give us and spit out a lot of information at us, and often quite factually correct, especially if it's being created by a nutritionist with a reputable kind of, I suppose, source. Reaching out to some of the smaller nutrition practitioners, you're not going to hear back from those that have got millions of followers. But if you find a nutritionist that's working in sport who is potentially, working with a couple of clubs, not many followers, often you can get a response from them in terms of any questions. I'm certainly one of those, nutritionists that doesn't have a big platform, but I have it there as just a bit of an accountability tool, really. But I get a lot of questions, not necessarily around plant-based eating, but around all kinds of nutrition. And when I see them, I'm happy to answer because, I'm not somebody who's got an inundated inbox of hundreds, thousands of people trying to contact me. And I think use Google to your advantage because a good and a bad website. Now, the information that you're looking for isn't opinion, it's fact. You're trying to find out what foods are high in protein. Likelihood is people aren't going to lie on an article about what foods are high in protein, for example. So going on that article and having a look at the list of foods that they provide, but maybe the spiel above that might be around like different sources of protein and that you don't get complete proteins through vegetarian or vegan options versus incomplete and whatever it might be. Ignore that bit and just go to the factual bit that you want to actually look at, like, right, where's my list of shopping effectively as a plant-based eater. And I think that's probably a good starting foundation to be able to lead into if we're considering a plant-based kind of diet from now on.
And this is the last question on this section.
Yeah.
So pre and post session, whether that's as a rugby player or runner, we're looking at some plant-based recommendations that are going to help us perform.
Yeah. What are we eating?
What are we eating?
So in terms of what we'd want to eat, wouldn't change whether we're, I suppose, plant-based or just eating as normal, because the requirements of macronutrients are still the same. And again, this is where research comes into play in terms of doing your own research, finding the foods that are going to be beneficial for you. So typically speaking, 2 to 3 hours before a training session or a match or a long run as a runner, whether a rugby player or a runner, we want to look towards having something that's high in carbohydrates with a small amount of protein, some fats and some fruit and veg. So we pictured that on kind of a visual plate. 50% of our plate would be made up of carbohydrates, and then a quarter would be made up of fats and proteins, obviously fats being the smaller sliver of the two, and then the other quarter would be made up of our fruit and veg. So that would be our kind of pre-training plate that we'd have maybe 2 to 3 hours before. Now the next question, and maybe people watching this might be thinking, well, 2 hours and then training, I'm going to be so hungry by the time I get to my training session. So it's looking for some form of snacks that you can fill those 2 hours with. Try not to eat anything before 30 minutes before the session to allow for digestion. But it might be that we chuck in, if we're from home, a small slice of toast or a bagel 90 minutes before, and then 60 minutes before a cereal bar, a fresh piece of fruit, something along those lines. Now, regardless whether we're vegan or plant-based or a vegetarian or a kind of meat eater or a normal eating of food, that meal's consistency and the style isn't going to change. But making sure, for example, as a plant-based eater, we spoke about the struggles of protein, that you've got a good protein source within that meal. And likewise, after training, most athletes would sat here listening to this and think that we need more protein post-training. But if we were intently listening earlier, we were talking about how we need 20 to 40 grams every kind of 2 to 3 hours in like spaces of like 4 to 5 hits of protein in the day to support that growth and generation, or as I called it in the science word, muscle protein synthesis. So if we know that, and we know that more protein after training doesn't equal better recovery, then it's quite wasteful to go really high in protein. And I suppose as a plant-based eater, you might see that as a positive, because we don't have to suddenly start finding all these sources of protein that aren't meat-based. So it makes your life a lot easier. We just keep the same sized amount of protein post-training as what we would pre-training. The emphasis, which actually probably benefits a plant-based eater more, is more fruit and veg. So 50% of it, if we think of it on a plate again, 50% of our plate made of fruit and veg. So more vitamins and minerals going into the body to support recovery. Our fats and protein make up that quarter. And then, of course, carbs make up a quarter as well. So in terms of like putting training in the middle, 3 hours before, or 2 to 3 hours before last big meal, 90 minutes, 60 minutes before some form of snack. And then as soon as possible, we're going to have that meal or that snack that consists of high fruit and veg, same amount of protein, and then slightly lower carbs as a recovery meal. And I think one of the big common misconceptions when it comes to post-training food, and a myth that I'm conscious that we've got some myth busting, so maybe jumping the gun, is do we need to have food within 30 minutes, the 30-minute recovery window? And arguably yes, but there is a little bit of a but with that, because when we think about recovery, yes, we want to have food as soon as possible after training where possible, because what that'll do is that will kickstart our recovery phase. And if we leave it, let's say, 4 hours before having any food as opposed to 30 minutes, our recovery or optimal recovery window won't start until 4 hours after training, which might delay our ability to return at full recovery and might add 4 hours to that recovery. Whereas if we eat within that 30-minute window, it's optimal. It's not necessarily needed.